Welcome back. This is the Mahabharata podcast, episode 23, Into the Forest. Last time, we left off with dark foreboding as our heroes departed Hastinapur, having been deprived of their kingdom, their riches, and their honor. By agreeing to summon his nephews back for a final winner-take-all dice match, blind King Dhritarashtra managed to satisfy his wicked son while deferring the price to be paid for 13 years. Since the eldest Pandava, Yudhishthira, would never think of reneging on a deal, and his younger brothers would never abandon him, there was nothing to be done except head out to the forest and serve out their term. Their departure was not a peaceful affair, however. Dreadful omens were seen, and the brothers made clear their determination to see justice done. To underscore the fact that the Kaurava's victory was only a temporary affair, the sage Narada himself made an angry appearance at the court, only staying long enough to predict their doom in 13 years' time. Narada's prophecies were not taken lightly. Terrified, Duryodhana lost his nerve. He and his cronies, Karna and Shakuni, ran to Guru Drona to protect them. Duryodhana was ready to hand over all his ill-gained possessions if only Drona could protect them from the anger of their bereaved cousins. Drona promised to do what he could, assuring them that the Pandavas would surely live out their term in the forest. But, after living 12 years as Brahmacharyan, not even he could hope to defeat them. Furthermore, he reminded them that he had once taken away half the kingdom of Panchala, and that Draupadi's brother had specifically been born or created to kill Drona. Drona would do his best, but he didn't stand much of a chance. Drona's advice was for the conspirators to live it up, enjoy the riches while it lasted, because in 13 years' time it will all be over. As for King Dhritarashtra, he was miserable. His charioteer Sanjay was puzzled. He asked the king, "Now that you have won everything, why are you still unhappy?" The king asked, "So you think there's nothing to worry about when you have made enemies of the Pandavas and their allies?" Sanjay pointed out, "This was all your doing, king. You were warned not to offend your nephews, yet you indulged your foolish son, and this feud will end with the destruction of everyone." The king lamented, "When the gods turn against you, the first thing they do is take away your wits. When destruction is imminent, your mind gets clouded, and what seems like the right thing turns out to be the wrong one. Vidura warned me not to make enemies of them, but I didn't listen, because I wanted to please my son." Thus ends Book 2 of the Mahabharata, called the Book of the Assembly Hall. What follows comes from the third book, called the Book of the Forest. Book 3 opens with a street scene as the Pandavas were leaving Hastinapur for their forced banishment. The townspeople were apparently fed up with the shenanigans going on at court. They seditiously speculated on what kind of king Duryodhana would be. What would become of the people who were ruled by a wicked prince and cheating counselors? Following this chain of logic, the common people concluded that they would be better off in the jungle with a virtuous leader than to remain in Hastinapur with the gamblers, abusers, and cheat. Thus, while the Pandavas were heading out for the forest and making arrangements for their children to live with Krishna, a crowd of surly townspeople gathered, begging Yudhishthira to lead them all into the forest with him. I suppose, if Yudhishthira had been a politician instead of a noble, he might have offered to lead all the citizens away from Hastinapur, and thus get a little revenge on his cousins. Instead, he begged the townspeople to stay home. He pointed out that Bhishma, the king, his mother, and Vidur remained in Hastinapur. He said, "If you have our well-being at heart, you must, all of you, protect them with your best effort, for they are anguished by grief and sorrow. That is the task that lies highest in my heart, and with that you will content me fully and pay me homage." It is unclear at this point which direction the Pandavas went when they left Hastinapur, but we are told that they rode the chariots for the rest of the day and made camp on the banks of the Ganga. As evening came, a group of Brahmins caught up with them. They had followed the Pandavas out from Hastinapur. When the Brahmins presented themselves to the king and told him that they were ready to go into the forest with him, Yudhishthira said, "We've been robbed of our kingdom and robbed of our wealth. We're about to enter the forest and live on fruit, roots, and meat. The wilderness is full of predators and snakes. There will be great hardship for you there, and I will not be able to protect you. That would pain me greatly." But the Brahmins insisted, saying that they will fend for themselves and bring good luck for the Pandavas with their sacrifices. One of the wise Brahmins, named Shanaka, then spoke up and gave a lecture on attachment, wealth, and suffering. The Brahmin said love and attachment are the source of all misery. He argued that the rich are not happier than anyone else, and that pursuing wealth meant they were not pursuing righteousness. The Brahmin suggested that it was better to find contentment than to retrieve his kingdom. He concluded, saying, "Yudhishthira, have no desire for riches. If you want to act in accordance with Dharma, stay clear of a longing for riches." Obviously, Yudhishthira wasn't ready to renounce his future claims to his kingdom, so he argued with Shanaka, saying, "I don't pursue wealth as an end in itself, but I have a duty to feed my family, support the Brahmins, and feed the poor." These were mere excuses as far as Shanaka was concerned. He said, "Alas, the world has been overturned. When a person's mind is directed toward the objects of the senses, desire springs up in him. Even the man who's alert is seduced by his rapacious senses. Then, pierced by desire, he falls into the fire of greed. At last, he drowns in this madness and does not know himself. Thus he commits himself to life after life, lost in ignorance." Shanaka then began a lecture on the true path to salvation. In an oddly Buddhist vein, he even presented it in terms of an eightfold path, which, of course, was quite different from the Buddhist list. The Brahman's 8 items consisted of oblation, Vedic study, gifts, austerity, truthfulness, forbearance, self-control, and greedlessness. Interestingly, Shanaka then ticked off a second list of 8, which sound even more Buddhist. Correct intention, correct subdual of the senses, correct and precise vows, correct service to elders, correct apportionment of food, correct learning, correct renunciation of rights, and correct suspension of thoughts. Unlike Buddhist thinking, however, Shanaka's teaching did not aspire to nirvana. Instead, he pointed to the deities as the liberated souls one might hope to emulate. Shanaka concluded his lecture saying to Yudhishthira, "You have found the success one acquires by having a father and mother, and the success acquired by rights. Now seek success by austerities, for once you have succeeded by austerities, you will be like a god and do what you wish." I imagine getting lectured by sadhus telling you to renounce your wealth was an occupational hazard for ancient Indian kings. Yudhishthira surely had heard all this before, so he gave up the argument with Shanaka and turned to his loyal priest Dhamya for advice. Clearly, Shanaka was not going to help him fulfill his dharma and feed the Brahmins, so Yudhishthira asked Dhamya what to do. Clearly, if you're going to live in the jungle, you should bring along a good priest, because Dhamya had just the fix. Dhamya explained that all our sustenance comes ultimately from Surya, the sun. It so happened that Dhamya had learned the 108 names for Surya, and he instructed Yudhishthira to practice yoga, meditate, and recite the names of the sun god. Having completed his austerities, the sun god appeared and promised to feed them all with forest fare for the next 12 years. Yudhishthira then went to the commissary and came out with sufficient food to feed all the Brahmins, then his brothers, then himself, and finally Draupadi. As the author said, quote, "So it befell that the prince, brilliant like the sun, obtained from the sun this boon and gave the Brahmins what their hearts desired." Having worked out that this traveling party would consist of the Pandavas, Draupadi, and a gaggle of Brahmins, and then worked out a means of feeding them all, the group was led by the priest Dhamya to the Kamyaka forest. We are told that the journey to the Kamyaka forest led them through the field of the Kurus, Kurukshetra, and then across the Yamuna River, and then onto the Sarasvati River. They made their camp at the banks of the Sarasvati on the verge of the Kamyaka forest. We'll leave our heroes settled in the forest for now. I find it interesting how the journey into exile included just the 5 brothers and their primary wife and a growing mob of Brahmins. Remember, there are a couple of other wives and 6 or 7 sons who did not go into the forest. So far, we have not been told where the wives and kids went either. We'll at least find out more about them later. It was also interesting how this obscure Brahmin Shanaka had the temerity to advise the king that he should give up all his ambitions and dependence and live a life of austerity. And he gave his sermon in terms of an oddly Buddhist eightfold path. Yudhishthira politely heard the guy out, but then diplomatically turned to his pet priest Dhamya to get more practical advice. That's all for now. It's good to be back after an unexpected hiatus. Thanks for all your kind comments, and especially for sending me ratings on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 24, Into the Forest, Part 2. We left off last time with the Pandavas having assembled a traveling party of Brahmins and then settled down in northwestern India along the banks of the Sarasvati River. With Dhamya's guidance, Yudhishthira had managed to summon the sun god and won from him the ability to produce food for himself and all his followers. Meanwhile, back in Hastinapur, Duryodhana and his father the king were beginning to panic at the prospect of what they had set in motion. Not long after settling in the forest, the Pandavas' uncle Vidur suddenly appeared. While he might be their dear and sympathetic uncle, he was also the king's man, so imagine their consternation when he arrived at their camp. Yudhishthira asked Bhima, "What do you think the steward is up to? Is he coming to summon me to another dice game? You know that once challenged I am unable to refuse." Then the 5 brothers stood up and greeted their uncle with due respect. Vidor quickly dispelled their fears. He had not come on the king's business. In fact, the king had thrown him out. It turned out that King Dhritarashtra was no happier after their exile than before, and had turned to his younger brother for comfort. Vidor immediately set to accusing the king of acting in bad faith and advising that he should send Duryodhana out to the forest and take back the Pandavas. This was not what the king wanted to hear, and getting no sympathy from his brother, he got irate. Dhritarashtra accused Vidor of being more loyal to his nephews than he was to the king. The king sent Vidor away, saying, "Go where your confidence lies. No more do I want you as my companion." And so Vidor packed up his chariot and headed out to the Kanyaka forest to join his nephews. After explaining to the Pandavas why he'd shown up here, Vidor then broke out into one of his preachy lectures on Dharma. He said, "When you are oppressed by your rivals, exert your patience and bide your time. The self-possessed man will rule the earth. If you share your wealth with your helpers will also share in distress. This is how you hold on to your helpers, and with them you will conquer the world." Finally, Vidor said, "Tell the truth without complaint. Share food equally with your companions, and do not put yourself before others. This is how a king prospers." In contrast to his uncle, Yudhishthira warmly welcomed his uncle's moralizing. He said, "I shall do as you counsel me, Vidor, and will thoughtfully practice your great wisdom." Thus, Vidor joined his nephews in their humble camp in the woods. Not long after, Dhritarashtra began missing his brother. His mind spinning with inner conflict, he even passed out in open court in front of all the kings and lords. His loyal charioteer Sanjay rushed to his aid, and when the king regained consciousness, he told Sanjay, "My brother and friend is like the god of Dharma incarnate. As I remember him now, my heart is torn apart. Bring him back to me at once." Sanjay readily agreed that it was time to bring back the steward. He jumped on his chariot and rode out to Kanyaka forest. As he approached Yudhishthira's camp, he saw Yudhishthira, clothed in deerskins, sitting with Vidor, surrounded by his brothers and thousands of Brahmins. After greeting each of them according to their status, Sanjay addressed Vidor and told him that his brother the king begged him to return to Hastinapur. Once again, Vidor jumped onto his chariot and rode back with Sanjay to Hastinapur. The blind king embraced his brother and begged Vidor's forgiveness. The news of Dhritarashtra's reconciliation with Vidor quickly made its way to Duryodhana and his cronies. Duryodhana complained that Vidor was his enemy and would poison the mind of his father. Working himself into a temper tantrum, Duryodhana turned to his counselors and demanded that they advise him in some way to neutralize Vidor's influence with the king. He said, "Counsel me to my benefit, so that Vidor does not reverse the king's mind and bring the Pandavas back. If I see my cousins somehow return here, I shall take poison, or the noose, or the sword, because I cannot bear to see them here and rich again." Exasperated, Shakuni scolded his nephew. "You are a king, a lord of your people, yet you give in to these childish thoughts. The Pandavas made an agreement and they left. They will not return. The Pandavas live by the truth of their oaths. They would never accept the king's invitation. My advice is that we hang back for now and watch for weakness with the Pandavas." The toady Dushasan readily agreed with his uncle. Karna too endorsed Shakuni's advice. Having consensus among his advisers, Duryodhana accepted their words, but not too happily. Karna was very sensitive to his friend's moods and gestures, and the look Duryodhana gave him stirred on his loyalty. Karna turned angrily on Shakuni and Dushasan and declared, "We all want to do anything we can to please our prince, but none of us will stay in his favor if we do not act now. So let's don our armor, mount our chariots, and kill these Pandavas right now while they are weak." This was just what Duryodhana wanted to hear, so everybody gave a cheer and prepared to make war on their defenseless cousins. Clearly, at this point, the plot of the story was in real danger of spinning out of control. The half-naked Pandavas were defenseless and exposed in the jungle, while an armored contingent rumbled across the plains set on their destruction. Who could save them now? It was time for the author of the story to intervene. Sage Vyasa was instantly aware of what was about to happen, and he appeared before the war party and halted it. Vyasa simply ordered them to desist, and they just turned around and went home. Vyasa then went to the king's court to talk to the errant prince's father. This was Vyasa's first opportunity to express what he thought of the whole dice affair, and he really laid into the king. He said, "It does not please me that the Pandavas were cheated and sent to the forest, king. In 13 years they will remember all of this and will bring terrible vengeance. If your feeble-minded son tries to kill them in the forest, he will only lose his own life. War with your own relatives is lawless infamy. My advice to you is to send your own son to the forest and live with the Pandavas. alone and without his cronies. Then perhaps some love will spring up in him for the Pandavas, and you might succeed in saving his life." King Dhritarashtra repentantly agreed with Vyasa's analysis, and told him he had already received similar advice from Vidur, Drona, Kripa, and Bhishma. Knowing his own weakness, the king begged Vyasa to go to Duryodhana and try to set him straight. I guess Vyasa had done enough meddling in his own story already, because just then another sage named Maitreya arrived in Hastinapur. Rather than going in person and talking to Duryodhana, Vyasa told the king, "Here comes the blessed seer Maitreya, just arrived from staying with the Pandavas. This great seer shall lecture your son, and whatever he says, I suggest you carry it out assiduously, because if you do not heed him, he will surely lay a curse on you." Vyasa then departed, and on his heels came the sage Maitreya. The king greeted the sage with all due respect and asked him what news from his travels. The sage said, "While touring the pilgrimage sites, I came across Yudhishthira in the forest. There were crowds of holy men all come to see this great-spirited man. While there, I was told about your son's wicked behavior at the dice match. I have always loved the Kurus, and so I have made my way to you." The grumpy old sadhu then lectured the king, telling him that he was to blame for the strife among his heirs. At some point during this scene, Duryodhana himself showed up to greet the sage. He was not pleased at what Maitreya had to say. The sage turned to Duryodhana and said, "Lord Duryodhana, for your own good, do not offend the Pandavas. They are valiant warriors, are sworn to the truth, and are killers of God's foes." Maitreya then listed some of the Pandavas' more impressive feats, such as killing Jarasandh, defeating the famous Rakshasas Hidimba, Baka, and even the ferocious ogre named Kirmira. Duryodhana only smirked at his cronies, slapped his thigh, and made pictures in the sand. When Maitreya noticed that the boy wasn't taking him seriously, he exploded in rage. Maitreya touched water and cursed him. "Because you ignore me and will not obey me, you shall soon reap the reward of your insolence. Through your offense, a great war will flare up, and during that war, Bhima will smash your thigh with his club." Dhritarashtra pleaded with Maitreya to revoke his curse, but the sage replied, "If your son seeks peace, then the curse will not take effect. It is up to him." The court went silent in contemplation of their fate. Finally, King Dhritarashtra broke the silence with the curious question, "You said Bhima killed Kirmira? How did he manage that?" I'll leave it until next episode to tell you the story of Bhima and Kirmira. I find it interesting how in this story they trade out one sage for another in the middle of the plot line. The story starts with Vyasa stopping Karna's raid, but then he leaves in the middle to be replaced by the more obscure sage Maitreya. Thus it is Maitreya who loses his temper and curses Duryodhana. One purpose of the story appears to be further justification for Bhima much later in the story, when he somewhat unfairly strikes Duryodhana below the belt. I know there are apologists for Duryodhana out there, and they like to point to that final battle as evidence of the Pandavas' infamy. Now we can excuse Bhima and point to Maitreya as the cause for Bhima's unfair blow. That's all for now. Next time, we'll follow Bhima's ogre-killing exploits, a visit from the Pandavas' allies, and Arjun's journey into the Himalayas. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 25, Draupadi's Lament, Krishna's Excuse. Last time, we finished a handful of short vignettes surrounding the Pandavas' move into the forest and the Kauravas' subsequent feelings of fear and guilt. The last of these was a complicated little story of how Duryodhana had summoned a war party and set off to kill the Pandavas, who were defenseless in the woods. The author of this story, Vyasa himself, showed up and put a stop to the raid. Vyasa then delegated the job of scolding Duryodhana to a lesser saint named Maitreya. Maitreya warned the boy of the danger he was in, and he listed the feats of the Pandavas, including the killing of the ogre Kirmira. Duryodhana had little respect for this substitute sage, and he provoked Maitreya to anger. The sage then cursed the boy, promising that Bhima would break his thigh with the club. As the court quietly contemplated the significance of this curse, Dhritarashtra wanted to know more about how Bhima killed this famous ogre. The angry sage was in no mood for storytelling, and he stormed out of the court, saying, "I'm done talking to you. You grumble and your son is disobedient. Let your steward tell you what happened." I guess old Dhritarashtra was getting tired of all the drama and dire predictions, and simply wanted to change the subject to a fight scene. So the king ordered Vidur to tell them what he knew of the big fight. It turned out that Vidur was nearly a witness to the event. He told the court that when he had been sent away, on his way to the Pandavas' camp, he had come across the gigantic corpse of the Rakshasa Kirmira. He interrogated the sadhus who were loitering around the corpse, and found out from them how the ogre had been killed. It turned out that the very patch of woods chosen by the Pandavas to be their camp was inhabited by Baka's bigger, meaner brother. Remember, Baka was the Rakshasa that was terrorizing villagers during the brothers' last exile, and Bhima killed him. It also turned out that old Hidimba, the first Rakshasa killed by Bhima, was Kumara's bosom friend. So, when the ogre discovered that his arch-enemy had appeared in his own neck of the woods, he prepared to get his revenge against Bhima. The ogre's attack began in the form of terrifying sounds and apparitions. Damya was able to step in with his counter-magic and dispel the fear, but by then poor Draupadi, still disheveled from her abuse at the hands of Dushasan, had swooned and was held up by her 5 husbands. Having been stripped of his illusions, the Rakshasa then appeared before the brothers in his raw fury. In proper bad guy fashion, Kumara made a little speech before beginning his attack. He said, "It is my good fortune that the gods fulfilled my desire here today. I have been roaming the earth with my weapons, ready to kill Bhimasena. Today I shall repay the debt to my brother and drink Bhima's blood." Yudhishthira declared, "You shall not," and while Arjun strung his bow, Bhima stopped Arjun, then uprooted a full-grown tree and approached the beast. Kumara also uprooted a tree, and the two commenced a tree fight there in the woods. The combined blows of the two shook the ground and cleared the forest, felling trees in all directions. Bhima managed to shatter Kumara's tree, and the ogre picked up a large rock and struck Bhima on the head with it. The blow to the head stunned Bhima, and Kumara wrapped his arms around Bhima and gave him a powerful squeeze. Bhima then returned the favor, and the two fighters commenced a wrestling match. Bhima's mind then settled on all the injustices that he and his brothers had suffered by the Kauravas, and the fury and outrage welled up in him like an irresistible flood. Thinking of what he'd like to do to cousin Duryodhana, Bhima increased his grip tenfold until he heard a satisfying crunch. He then shook his enemy violently until there was no more life left in his opponent. Kumara was dead and broken. Vidor summed up his story, saying, "Thus it was that the mighty Kumara was defeated at the word of King Yudhishthira." We can't be sure exactly how the court of the Kauravas reacted to this news, because the story cuts immediately back to the Pandavas' camp, where a meeting of the allies was taking place. When news of their defeat and exile had arrived in the courts of their allies, the Bhojas, Vrishnis, Andakas, King Drupad of Panchala, and Drishtateku of Chedi all sent representatives to meet with the Pandavas. Krishna, who was of Vrishni, was among the visitors, and he was particularly annoyed to hear of their mistreatment at the dice game. In fact, he worked himself into such a rage that he said, "The earth shall drink the blood of Duryodhana, Karna, Dushasan, and Shakuni. Then we shall reinstate King Dharma Yudhishthira. One who uses trickery deserves death." Arjun began to worry that Krishna might wipe out half of India in his anger, and so he calmed him down by reciting some of his feats in past lives. Arjun described how, when Krishna was a hermit, presumably Narayan, he had wandered homeless for 10,000 years and had stood on one leg for 100 years. As young Krishna, he had once traversed the earth, the sky, and heaven in 3 strides. He had risen to the sky and had outshone the sun. Arjun said, "There is no anger in you, no falsehood, no envy, no cruelty. At the end of the eon, you dissolve all creatures, and having made the world your own within your very self, yet you remain." Arjun's praise succeeded in talking him down. Krishna, recognizing his own self in Arjun, said to him gently, "He who hates you hates me. Who follows you follows me. You are Nara, and I am Narayan, the seers who have come to this world. You are no other than I, and I am no other than you. No difference can be found between the two of us." The two friends continued to share lovely sentiments with each other, until finally Draupadi had heard enough. She broke in and addressed Krishna. "They say that you were present at the creation of the universe, and that you are the invincible Vishnu. The wise men tell us that you are the earth and the truth. So how was it that the wife of the Pandavas and your friend was dragged into the gambling hall, stained with blood, and in a single garment I was grievously dragged before the assembly of the Kurus? In front of all these kings, the sons of Dhritarashtra burst out laughing at my shame. All of this happened while you and my husbands were still living, and yet you did nothing. I detest the Pandavas, who are all famous warriors, and yet they looked on while I was molested and did nothing. A plague on the strength of Bhimasena, a plague on Arjun's bowmanship. Both just stood by while those churls abused me. Tell me, Janardhan, is it not the ancient law that a husband, however weak he may be, always protects his wife? I am the mother to their 5 sons, so at least for their sake my husbands should have protected me." As she gave voice to her outrage, the lovely Panchali began weeping. the tears streaming down her face. She said, "I have no husbands, and no sons, nor a brother, nor a father, nor friends, if you mercilessly ignored me when I was assaulted." Deeply moved by her tirade, Krishna declared, "I promise that you will see your enemies' women weeping over the fallen bodies of those who offended you. I shall do whatever can be done. You shall surely be a queen of kings. Let the sky fall, the mountains crumble, and the sea dry up, but my words shall not be false." Draupadi's brother, Drishtadyumna, also chimed in. "I shall kill Drona, Sikandin shall kill Bhishma, Bhimasena shall kill Duryodhana, and Arjun shall kill Karna. My dear sister, if we rely on Krishna, we shall be invincible." The thought of all this bloody vengeance soothed her a bit. Then Krishna spoke again. "If I had been present in Dwarka at the time, none of this would have happened. I would have attended the match and would have stopped it before any of this had happened. Even if I wasn't invited, I would have come anyway. I would have pointed out the many things wrong with gambling, and if they didn't listen to me, I would have stopped them by force. And if they had resisted me, I would have destroyed them. But, unfortunately, I was out of town, and by the time I had heard the news, it was too late. So I made my way directly to this forest to meet you." It wasn't like Krishna to speak in subjunctives and make excuses, so clearly he must have been away on important business. So Yudhishthira asked him, "Why were you absent? Where did you travel to, and what were you doing there?" Krishna answered, "I had to make a trip to Sabha, King Shalva's capital, and wipe that city off the face of the earth." That's all for now. I'll leave you with another cliffhanger until the next episode. Before we go, there are a few interesting things about this episode that I'd like to point out. First, this story establishes for the first time Draupadi's role as goad to action, a part which he plays throughout the period of exile. Remember back when King Drupada Panchala held a sacrifice to birth an heir who would get revenge against Drona. This sacrifice resulted in the birth of Drishtadyumna, who was destined to be the killer of Drona, but it also produced Drishtadyumna's sister Draupadi. I think now we're beginning to see how Draupadi may be as important in winning Drupad's revenge as her brother. Whenever the Pandavas consider making peace or retiring to the wilderness, Draupadi is right there, reminding them of her grievance and goading them to settle for nothing less than bloody revenge. This point leads us to the one line Draupadi's brother has in the story, in which Drishtadyumna assigns a victim to each of the main heroes. He will kill Drona, Arjun will kill Karna, etc. Curiously, he mentions one other warrior who is not among our main characters. He says that Sikandin would be the one who kills Bhishma. If you're not already familiar with this character, I'll let you savor the mystery for now. Just be sure to keep in mind that old story, way back when Bhishma's younger half-brother, Vichitravirya, was still king. Bhishma had gone to Kashi and had abducted 3 princesses to be his brother's wives. Remember, the eldest princess Amba had already been betrothed to King Shalva, and so Bhima let her go. For now, just keep in mind that Amba was not at all happy about how things turned out, and this warrior Sikandin is seeking Amba's revenge. Finally, it is curious that after Arjun's long panegyric on Krishna's omnipotence, Draupadi had Krishna making excuses for allowing the dice game to take place at all. According to Krishna, it was just a comedy of errors, and had he known what was happening, he would have never allowed it. I had pointed out during the first dice game that there was some disagreement in the sources whether Krishna had intervened to save Draupadi. It seems, from the excuses he made here in the forest, that he really was unaware of what had happened to Draupadi until well after it was over. That's all for now. Next time we'll find out why Krishna felt the need to utterly destroy a city. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 26, Debating Dharma. Last episode, we left off with Krishna making excuses for not being there to stop the dice game that sent the Pandavas to exile and fired Draupadi's determination to see the destruction of the Kauravas. Krishna said that he certainly would have halted the Kaurava shenanigans had he only known what was happening, but unfortunately he was busy leveling a city, and so he had not gotten news of the game until it was well over. It would seem that this lapse on Krishna's part undermined his reputation for omniscience. But what do I know about these things? Whatever happened, Krishna missed his chance to change history, and he had to answer Draupadi for it. As for what had happened while Krishna was away, he said he had been busy destroying the city of Sabha. This was big news in itself, so everyone in the forest gathered around to hear about Krishna's violent conflict with King Shalva. If the name Shalva sounds familiar, it's because we met him before, way back when Bhishma's half-brother Vichitravirya was king. As I mentioned last time, Bhishma had abducted the 3 princesses of Kashi to become wives for his brother. Only after taking these women to Hastinapur did Bhishma find out that the eldest was already pledged to Shalva. Bhishma had fought off Shalva during his getaway from Kashi, so Shalva already had a grudge against the Kurus. Matters were only made worse during Yudhishthira's royal consecration ceremony, in which Krishna was given the place of honor, and Sishupal of Chedi was killed by Krishna for refusing to accept Krishna's elevation. We are not told here why exactly Shalva was so angry over Sishupal's murder, but he was so angry that he boarded his Vimana, which is described as a floating city named Salbha, and flew it to Dwarka, where he besieged the city. Travel by flying Vimana was much quicker than going by chariot, so the siege began while Krishna and his fellow nobles were still journeying overland from Indraprastha. The fortress city of Dwarka was only defended by a handful of second-tier warriors led by Krishna's son, Pradyumna. What ensued was a typical Bronze Age standoff, except Shalva was flying around bombing Dwarka by air. Despite his youth and inexperience, Pradyumna defended his city heroically. Once his arrows scored a direct hit on Shalva and knocked him senseless, but the angry king soon recovered and resumed his assault. King Shalva's counterattack nearly killed the young Pradyumna. The boy was hit in the chest and fell into his chariot. His driver, fearing for Pradyumna's life, turned the chariot around and fled straight for the city gates. When the boy awoke from his swoon, he scolded the charioteer, telling him that a proud Kshatriya never turns his back on the battlefield. The boy rejoined the fray, and Shalva then resorted to magical Asura arrows, but Pradyumna deflected them with his own Brahma missile, followed by a flurry of more conventional arrows. Shalva was knocked back by the attack, and Pradyumna saw his chance. Stringing the arrow that would be Shalva's death, the prince was interrupted by a great wind and loud voices, saying, "You may not kill Shalva. It has been preordained that Devaki's son Krishna will have the duty." The boy obediently put back the arrow and allowed Shalva to remount his Vimana and retreat to his kingdom with all his soldiers. It was only after Shalva's attack on Dwarka had been repulsed that Krishna finally arrived home to see the damage. After surveying the destruction and hearing of the heroics of his son and the other Vrishni defenders, Krishna announced that he was going to take the war to the lands of King Shalva, and he would not return home until Shalva was dead. Krishna led a war party in search of Shalva. They traveled over mountains and across rivers to find him. Finally, they encountered Shalva, hovering in his Vimana over the ocean. Krishna's warriors fired their arrows, but were unable to reach the floating craft high up in the atmosphere. Finally, Krishna whispered arcane spells to his bow and fired those magical bolts into Shalva's midst. The arrows tore through Shalva's supporters, killing and dismembering his warriors on all sides. In anger, Shalva brought his Vimana in close, and the two forces traded magical attacks until night and day could not be distinguished. In the confusion of the melee, Shalva slipped away in his Vimana and launched a second surprise attack on Dwarka. Thus, while Krishna's forces were engaged in battle in this remote spot, they received a message that Dwarka was under assault, and Krishna's father Vasudeva had been killed. Krishna confessed that at that moment he reviled both his son and his brother. He had left them behind to defend the city, and yet somehow the city was under attack and his father was dead. He considered how he could possibly make it back home in time to be of any help, while the thought of his father dying consumed him with sadness and indecision. While the battle still raged around him, Krishna fell into a deep funk, sitting down in his chariot and refusing to fight. His mind reeling, he suddenly grasped the solution to his problem. None of this was real. It was all an illusion. Shalva's magic had nearly caused him to flee the battle. The spell now broken, Shalva's Vimana appeared before him, and Krishna resumed his attack, killing many of Shalva's shipmates. The Vimana then exhibited its ability to turn invisible, and then suddenly appeared and began raining down enormous mounds of earth, burying Krishna and scattering his army. Finally deciding to end the conflict, Krishna broke out his favorite weapon, the magic frisbee Sudarshana Chakra. He blew away all the earth that had covered him, and then directed his disc at Shalva's Salbha Vimana. Growing to fit the need, the disc cut right through the enormous floating city, breaking it into two, and, on its return path, cutting him into two pieces as well. The floating city crashed to the earth in an enormous shambles. Krishna surveyed the destruction, and then returned home victorious. He explained again that it was only after returning from this epic battle that he learned of the Pandavas' exile. When Krishna finished telling this story, he and the other allies packed up their chariots and left for home. No one had answered Draupadi's complaints, but it was obvious that the plan was to wait 13 years, and only then would they decide on their mode of revenge. All the Brahmins in the Pandavas' camp probably were relieved to see the pack of warriors go, because after the allies departed, they gathered around Yudhishthira. One of their leaders then began a long speech on the importance of keeping lots and lots of Brahmins around. Yudhishthira didn't argue with them on this, and the Brahmins were content to live in the forest with their half-Brahmin Sadhu king. Draupadi was by no means content to see her husbands transformed into holy Brahmins, and that evening after dinner she laid into them. She said to Yudhishthira, "I remember how you used to live in your palace. I remember your throne of gold and ivory, how you were glowing with sandal paste, like the sun, surrounded by kings. And now I see you in your deerskin skirts, covered in mud and clothed in tree bark. I remember when your brothers each had their own hall and had feasts for thousands of guests, and now they sleep on the ground and eat roots. They did not deserve this, and my heart finds no peace. Look at Bhima moping around in the dust. He used to be so proud. Doesn't that make you angry?" She went on with her complaint, pointing to each of her husbands in turn, describing how low he had fallen, all with the refrain, "And doesn't that make you angry?" She then pointed to herself, saying, "You have seen me go to the forest, me who was born of the ancient lineage of Draupadi. So why didn't your anger soar? There's no Kshatriya in the world who's without anger. In you I now see the opposite. A knight who does not act when necessary is despised by all. Therefore," she said, "I think it is time that you stood up against the offensive Kauravas. The time for forgiveness is past. Now is the time for action." Facing a mutiny, Yudhishthira replied with a lecture on self-control. He said, "Anger kills men, but it never makes them better off. An angry man will do evil. He may even kill his elders. With insight, the wise control their anger. Truth prevails over falsehood, and mildness over cruelty. Be content, Draupadi, to be patient, and do not be angry. Be assured that Bhishma, Vidur, Drona, and Vyasa are all urging peace. Duryodhana is sure to return our kingdom, and if not, he will certainly perish. A terrible time has come for the undoing of the Bharatas. This has been my conclusion, angry Krishna. Duryodhana is not capable of patience, and can find none. I am capable of patience, and therefore patience has found me. The way of those who have mastered themselves is to be patient and gentle." Draupadi was not impressed. She replied acidly, "The Lord has befuddled your brains. You should carry on in the way of your father and grandfather, but your mind has gone soft. I think you would abandon me, your brothers, and even your mother before you would give up Dharma. They say that Dharma protects the king who upholds it, but it does not protect you. Your mind is obsessed at your dishonest defeat at dice. You lost your kingdom, your riches, your brothers, and me. You used to be upright, gentle, modest, and truthful, so how could the spirit of gambling overtake you? My mind has become utterly bewildered and burns with grief, as I see this sorrow of yours and this great distress." Her distressed husband now took a more consoling tone, saying, "I hear your well-phrased and polished words, Yagyaseni. I do not act in quest of the fruits of Dharma. I give because I must. I sacrifice because I must. By its nature, my mind is committed to Dharma. He who wants advantages from Dharma does not obtain its reward. Do not doubt Dharma, for he who doubts it becomes an animal. He who doubts Dharma finds no other standard, and ends up setting himself as a standard, and he insolently despises his betters. For those who travel to heaven, Dharma is their only ship. Therefore let your doubts perish, Draupadi." Draupadi argued back, "I am not condemning Dharma in any way, king. Action is required of all living creatures. Only inanimate matter does not need to act. As long as you do not get attached to the results, action is always called for. We may succeed or we might fail, but in either case we shall have acted, and we will win glory." Bhima's frustration at the futility of this exchange moved him to speak. "We should be acting like the kings that we are. Our lands were taken unfairly, and so we should pursue justice. Why do we sit here in animal skins, living off the dirt and rocks? The pursuit of justice is our highest duty. Sometimes a higher duty trumps a lesser one. Arjun is unmatched in the 3 worlds at the bow, and I am undefeated with my club. How could we fail to take back our kingdom?" He continued, "There is no worse calamity for a Kshatriya than to lose your kingdom to a lesser man, but yet you sit here and quietly accept this. You are as meek as a Brahmin. How is it you were born a Kshatriya? Kshatriyas are usually born tough-minded. We have already lived in the forest for 13 months, my king, and advisors say that for rituals a month may be substituted for a year. Therefore, let's go now and kill our enemies, because for us there is no Dharma other than to fight." Yudhishthira sighed deeply and brooded a while. Then finally he said, I hear what you are saying, but consider, impulsive acts have bad outcomes. Only well-advised, well-planned actions can lead to success. Consider also that we made many enemies during our world conquest. All of our enemies have now joined together and will not be easily defeated. While Bhima remained unhappy and dissatisfied, he would not defy his older brother. And besides, he could not think of a better argument, so he made no reply. As the two Pandavas were thus engaged in argument, Vyasa arrived at their camp. After the usual greetings, Vyasa spoke. Yudhishthira, I know the thoughts in your heart and your fears, and so I have hurried here to set your heart at ease. He went on, the time is coming for your victory, when Dhananjaya Arjun will overpower his enemies in battle. Vyasa then taught Yudhishthira a magical spell called conjuration. He also advised that they send Arjun to the mountains, and there he would acquire weapons from Indra, Rudra, and Varuna. Finally, Vyasa took a look at their encampment and said, Now you should leave this forest. The deer have been eaten up and the plants and herbs are scarce. Find another suitable place for you and all your Brahmins. Ever obedient, Yudhishthira broke up camp and moved to a new spot. These movements are curious, but I'll get into that later. For now, the point is that the brothers moved to a new location, and only after that did Yudhishthira act on the rest of Vyasa's advice. After settling down, the Dharmaraja called a meeting and told Arjun what Vyasa had recommended. Yudhishthira said, Arjun is the master of archery, but Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, and Drona's son Ashvatthama are all equally masters of the art. Dhritarashtra's son has carefully cultivated their alliance. Furthermore, Duryodhana has sway over all the kings of the world. For our part, we have only you to rely on, you who are our only hope, and so you will need some help if we are to succeed. I have a secret knowledge that I acquired from Vyasa, and with it the entire universe will become visible to you. Possessing this power, you must seek out the gods. You will need to perform great austerities and then travel north, seek out Indra, because he has the weapons we shall need to accomplish our ends. Yudhishthira then trained Arjun in the secret mantras, and the left-handed archer consecrated himself and then departed for the Himalayas, equipped with his Gandhava bow and armed for a fight. That's all for now. Next time, we'll follow Arjun's exploits as he journeys into the heavenly realms in search of weapons. Before we go, I'd like to point out one inconsistency in the story concerning the places our heroes made camp. Following the dice game, we were told that the Pandavas journeyed straight to the Kanyaka forest. They remained in the Kanyaka woods through the meeting with Krishna in episode 25. Strangely, the next chapter begins to jump back in time to the Pandavas' departure from the dice game. I left this out of our narrative because it is a rehash of the first departure, with the townspeople begging to join the brothers in the woods. The story is different this time in that as they left, Arjun suggested that they set up camp at Lake Dvaitavana and not Kanyaka. In this retelling, we skip the scene with Krishna and the allies and go straight to the big debate between Draupadi and Yudhishthira. As we discussed, Vyasa then shows up and advises that they move camp to the Kanyaka woods, which they do. This second telling of the departure to the woods is inconsistent with the first version. It gives me the strong impression that these might have been two separate versions of the same story, but that both were too good to only pick one, so both were included. That's my guess anyway. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, episode 27. Arjun Goes to Heaven. Last time, we heard Krishna's excuse for not protecting his friends at the dice game. It turned out he was out of town making war against a flying city, and didn't find out about the dice game until it was too late. At least we got a stirring fight scene out of it, and how could we have ever transitioned into the age of Kali if not for the dice game that led to the war in Kurukshetra? After Krishna and his allies had all departed for home, leaving the Pandavas alone with their wife, Draupadi really lit into them for being so sheepish. Our heroes had been in the woods for over a year by this point, and Draupadi had refused to braid, comb, or wash her hair until she had first cleansed it in Dushasana's blood. By now, she must have had the appearance of one of the Furies. The remainder of that episode consisted mostly of Draupadi's complaints and Yudhishthira's philosophizing. Perhaps suspecting fractures among the brothers, Vyasa hurried over to help out. First, he reassured Yudhishthira that they were on the right path, and he then gave them a mission to fulfill for the remainder of their exile. They should seek out weapons of mass destruction. Specifically, Arjun was deputed to head for the northern passes of the Himalayas in search of the weapons from the various gods. Dressed as an ascetic, and yet armed for war, Arjun made his way to the mountains. Because of his already austere life and the magic he had learned from Vyasa, Arjun was able to cross the mountains in a single day. The following day, Arjun reached a region called Indrakila. As he entered, he encountered a sadhu under a tree, who was literally glowing with the power of his austerities. Arjun quickly saw through the man's disguise and knelt before him in due respect to Lord Indra. The god laughed in delight to see his precocious son, saying, "Bless you, choose a boon from me." Arjun cut to the chase. "The boon I desire from you is to teach me all the magical weapons that exist." Indra replied with mock surprise, "You just set foot in paradise, my son, so what need have you for weapons in heaven?" Arjun answered ardently, "I have no desire for paradise or divinity. If I abandon my brothers in the forest without having revenge, I shall live in infamy for time without end." Indra then stood up, and his tone got more serious. "First, you must seek out Shiva, and only then shall I teach you all the weapons of the gods. When you have found Shiva, you shall succeed at all your endeavors, and heaven shall be yours." With single-minded purpose, Arjun then climbed to a mountain peak and began a new round of austerities. For a month, he lived on fruit just once every 4 days. On the second month, he ate only once every 8 days, and on the third month, he only ate once in 2 weeks, and then only eating fallen leaves. On the fourth month, Arjun lived on just the wind, spending the month with his arms upraised and balancing on the balls of his feet. The power of these austerities sent shockwaves through Devaloka. This upstart was making the Devarishis look bad, and so a group of them went running to their patron Shiva to complain. They whined, "The mighty Arjun has dedicated himself to impossible mortifications. We are frightened at what he might achieve. Please stop him." Shiva soothed his touchy followers, saying, "Don't worry about it. I know what he's after, and he's not in competition with you guys. I'll visit him later today and give him what he desires." After the gaggle of sadhus had all gone back to their huts, Shiva transformed himself into the guise of a mountain man and flew down with a consort of women to Arjun's camp. Coincidentally, a Daitya had chosen just this moment to attempt to harass Arjun. The Daitya had turned himself into a magical boar and was charging at the meditating ascetic. Without hesitation, Arjun drew and strung his bow. The mountain man called out for Arjun to desist, saying, "Hold, I was the first to take aim at this beast." His mind completely focused on his prey, Arjun ignored the warning and fired off an arrow. At precisely the same time, the mountain man also loosed an arrow. The 2 arrows both struck the foul beast, and the effect was like a lightning strike. The beast died instantly and reverted back to its original Rakshasa appearance. Only then did Arjun look up and see who had fired the other arrow. What he saw was only described as looking like a mountain man surrounded by beautiful women. Smiling knowingly, Arjun asked him, "Who are you? Aren't you scared to be wandering in this dangerous forest with all your women? Why did you shoot at this beast when it was mine? Whether it was an accident or intentional, you will not get away, because it is contrary to the dharma of hunters to shoot another man's prey. For what you have done, you must die, mountain man." The mountain man only laughed and said pleasantly, "I saw it first, and was first to take aim, and it was my arrow that killed it. You have insulted me, dummy, and you will not escape me alive." The 2 then commenced a regular firefight, blasting volleys of iron arrows at each other. After some time, Arjun noticed that his arrows were all striking their targets, but were being absorbed by his opponent. The next thing he noticed was that his famous bottomless quivers were running out of arrows. At this point, it was clear his opponent was no mortal. Arjun began to suspect he was up against a king among the gods. Now out of arrows, Arjun tried beating the man with his bow, but the mountain man took the bow right out of his hands. Arjun then drew his sword, only to break it over his opponent's shoulders. He threw the hilt at the mountain man's head, and it simply shattered on impact. Beginning to wish the fight was over, Arjun picked up rocks and trees and beat the mountain man, but the man was imperturbed. But Arjun was not one to give up. He switched to his wrestling moves and attempted to body slam his opponent. But the mountain man just grabbed him by the shoulders and crushed him into a broken ball of flesh. His limbs mangled, Arjun Palguna lost control of his bowels and fell to the ground. His breathing stopped and he lost consciousness. The great hero, the only hope for victory against evil, Krishna's friend Arjun, was dead at the hands of the Lord of Destruction. The blessed Lord Shiva looked down at the corpse and said, "O Palguna, I am pleased with your heroic determination. No mortal has ever checked my might. Open your eyes and look at me, warrior. Now you shall defeat all your enemies." In an instant, Arjun was restored to health. Opening his eyes, our hero beheld Shiva's divine form. He prostrated himself before the god and begged him, "Lord of all creatures, forgive my offense. I came to this mountain to find you. Forgive me for fighting you in my ignorance." The god was forgiving, even praising Arjun above all other mortals. Arjun then pressed his luck, asking Shiva for weapons of mass destruction. He said, "If it pleases you to grant my wish, then I wish for the Pashupat weapon, which at the end of the eon will destroy the entire world. With this weapon I shall clear the world of Danavas, Rakshasas, and evil spirits. With it I shall fight Bhishma, Drona, and that rude son of a Sutta, Karna." The Lord was in a generous mood, and he granted Arjun's desire. Shiva pointed out that this was his best weapon, and that not even the other gods had this kind of firepower. No one in the three worlds is invulnerable to it. It could be launched with a bow, or a word, or even a glance, or just a thought. The only caution he gave was that Arjun should never use it against lesser opponents. Arjun then kneeled before Shiva and received the secret knowledge. Meanwhile, the sounds of cymbals, trumpets, and drums were heard in all directions, and the earth shook as Arjun manifested the dreadful missile before him. The god raised his hand in blessing and instructed Arjun lovingly, "Now you have what you are seeking. Now you should go to heaven." Shiva then vanished, leaving Arjun profoundly amazed at having been in the presence of the greatest god. Before the hero could recover from his astonishment, there appeared before him a vast panoply of Hindu divinities, including the gods Kuvera, Varuna, and finally Indra himself. In a thunderous voice, the god Yama of the underworld spoke. "Arjun, behold, the world guardians have assembled. We grant you divine eyesight. You are the ancient and mighty sage Nar, who assumed a mortal body at Brahma's request." The god of the dead then went on to recite the deeds Arjun will perform, including ridding the earth of the incarnated demons who had taken the bodies of the world's Kshatriyas. He then said, "Your fame will last forever, because you have matched Shiva himself in battle, and with Vishnu you will lighten the burden of the earth. Take my weapon, the irresistible staff." Arjun accepted the weapon, and then the other gods took turns delivering WMDs to their favorite. Varuna presented his inescapable Varuna nooses. Kubera gave him a spell for invisibility and for putting foes to sleep. Finally, Indra addressed the hero. "Strong-armed son of Kunti, you have a very great task to perform for the gods. If you wish to succeed, you must now ascend to heaven, where I shall give you the weapons of the gods." In a flash, all these gods disappeared. But as Arjun's eyes were still adjusting, he saw a fiery chariot approaching. Thinking this magnificent being must be another god, Arjun again prostrated himself, but the rider only laughed. He introduced himself as Matali, Indra's charioteer. He told Arjun that he was to give him a ride up to Indra's world. With some trepidation, Arjun mounted the fiery chariot, and they began to ascend up into the sky. As he ascended, he saw thousands of wondrous UFOs, filled with ascended masters, Gandharvas, and Apsaras. Finally, they reached Amaravati, the city of Indra. This was a rarefied land, occupied only by the spiritually accomplished. As Arjun entered the city, he was received with choirs of Apsaras. When Arjun reached Indra's court, the king of the gods stepped down from his throne to greet him. He was, after all, Arjun's father, and so he greeted his son, and with his arm over his shoulders, Indra led Arjun to sit on a throne next to his own. While the Gandharvas sang hymns and the naked Apsaras tried to distract them with their antics, Arjun was accepted with honor in his father's court, where he was served by the gods and instructed in the use of all of Indra's divine weapons. Arjun spent 5 years like this in Indra's palace. At the end of this time, when Arjun had mastered all the arts of war and destruction, he began to think of his poor brothers swatting mosquitoes in the foothills of Dehradun. Noticing his son's despondency, Indra assigned one final task for him to complete during his stay in heaven. He should learn the arts of music and dance from the divine musician Chitrasena. Around the same time, the wandering sage Lomasha arrived at Indra's court, and so the god instructed Lomasha to take a message to the Pandavas. He said, "Tell them not to worry about Arjun. He is safe and is learning the secrets of music and dance. In the meantime, the Pandavas should purify themselves and visit the pilgrimage sites. Soon enough, they will have a great task to perform on behalf of the gods." That marks the end for now of Arjun's adventures in heaven, because right after this, the story cuts over to King Dhritarashtra, as he learned from Vyasa that Arjun was in heaven gathering WMD. I bet you can guess by now that the blind king's reaction will include much hand-wringing and moralizing, but we'll get into the details next time. Before we go, I have to confess that I changed the story somewhat. The story is actually quite vague on what happened to Arjun at the end of the fight with Shiva. It says he was crushed into a ball of flesh and ceased breathing, but it is unclear how dead he really was. We're not told that Shiva revived him, only that he is somehow breathing again and is obviously no longer crushed into a ball of flesh. Considering that at the end of this scene, Arjun ascends up into heaven, I'm inclined to interpret this as a death and resurrection scenario. I suspect that the text is deliberately vague on this point, but I have no idea why that would be. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 28, Damayanti and Nala, Part 1. Last time, we followed Arjun's journey north, past the Himalayas and into mythical worlds beyond. Making camp on a mountain peak on the borders of Indra's kingdom, Arjun commenced to performing awesome austerities. According to the rules of Bronze Age spirituality, the more you deprive and discipline the body, the more spiritual power you can accrue. Never one to resort to half measures, Arjun went all out, going so far in his austerities that the gods themselves were threatened by his power. They need not have feared, because Arjun was not grasping for divinity. All he wanted was Shiva's weapons of mass destruction. Feeling the tug of Arjun's summons, Shiva descended to earth in the form of a tribal mountain man. Somehow knowing but not knowing the mountain man's identity, Arjun provoked a fight with the man. Arjun put up quite a fight, considering he was battling the Lord of Destruction, but his defeat was inevitable. Perhaps realizing that his defeat was imminent, Arjun engaged his opponent in a wrestling match. Shiva gave him a squeeze and crushed the hero into a ball of flesh. The narrative is obscure on whether Arjun was killed or just horribly maimed in this encounter, but Shiva restored him, gave him WMD, and sent him on to heaven, where he visited with his father Indra. While the four brothers Pandava stewed in their forest huts, for 5 years Arjun lived like a god in heaven, studying the arts of love and war. Meanwhile, news had reached the Kaurava court at Hastinapur of Arjun's journey into heaven. Vyasa had swung by for a visit and let it drop that Arjun was with Indra acquiring WMD. Once Vyasa had gone, Dhritarashtra turned to his confidant, the charioteer Sanjay. Fretfully, he asked, "Have you heard about Arjun's trip to heaven? How can we possibly resist his attack? My evil-spirited sons have all fallen into the power of death. I do not see how anyone could stand up to this archer's attack. Karna is unstable and Drona is growing old." Sanjay replied, "What you say is true, because the Pandavas are fired with anger over the maltreatment of their wife. I am well aware of how Arjun audaciously battled Shiva and won weapons from the world guardians. But I must say, by molesting Draupadi and enraging the Pandavas, your sons have brought this quarrel on themselves. However, by far your biggest mistake was that you overlooked the fact that they are Krishna's dear friends. You know, when he found out about the dice game, Krishna rushed down to the Kanyaka forest with many allies to meet with them. When he saw them in their reduced condition, he got indignant and promised to kill Duryodhana, Dushasan, and Karna, and then restore their kingdom. The only reason this has not already happened is that your nephew, the Dharma king, begged him to wait, saying he must keep his word and wait out the full 13 years before staking their claims. Then their allies all swore an oath to Draupadi, saying, 'Do not sorrow, princess, for we swear to you that the same ones who laughed at you will have their flesh eaten by carrion crows. The earth will drink the blood of those who molested you.' Wringing his hands helplessly, Dhritarashtra concluded, 'When the time has run out, there shall surely be war.' Back at the Pandavas' camp, the remaining brothers moped around, missing Arjun and worrying about him. Choking back tears, Bhishma scolded his elder brother. 'It was by your orders that Arjun left us for the mountains. He unquestioningly did as you told him, and now he may be lost to us. It was your gambling that led to all this, and yet you stopped us from killing the Kauravas when we had the chance. It is not the dharma of kings to sit in the forest and wait. The dharma of kings is to be a king. Let's fetch Arjun and Krishna right now and finish this. I will slaughter the sons of Dhritarashtra, Karna, Shakuni, and anyone else who gets in the way. Don't tell me it would be a sin to cut the exile short. I'm sure our Brahmins have a rite or a spell to absolve us. We'll surely attain the highest heaven, because we will have fulfilled our dharma. Besides, it is not considered a sin when a cheater is killed with deception." After Bhima had fully vented his frustration, Yudhishthira kissed his brother on the head and said, "Without question, you shall kill Duryodhana. but after the 13 years are over. But do not tell me the exile is over now, because falsehood is not in me. Time is only an illusion, and so your victory is as good as done already." While the family was thus occupied in their miseries, the sage Brihadashva arrived at their camp. After welcoming this holy guest, Yudhishthira confided his worries and concerns to the sage. Brihadashva said, "Are you trying to tell me that you consider yourself the most miserable king? There is another king who was unhappier than you." Yudhishthira said, "Okay then, tell me about this unhappy king. Maybe his misfortunes will make me feel better." And so Brihadashva began the story of Nala, king of Nishada. Nala was a powerful prince, much loved, good-looking, and interested in all the kingly pursuits, including weapons, hunting, and gambling. The story also concerns a certain princess named Damayanti. The daughter of King Bhishma of Vidarbha, she was one of those perfect, beautiful princesses. To anyone who met them, they were obviously the most eligible marriage candidates in the land. Nala had heard of Damayanti's qualities, but she was safely ensconced in her palace, so Nala had no chance of meeting her. One day, while out hunting, Nala captured a wild goose. The goose spoke in a human voice and begged Nala not to kill him. The goose promised that if he were set free, he would visit Princess Damayanti and tell her about him. Nala was happy to agree to this, and he set the goose free. The goose rejoined his flock, and together they flew to Damayanti's garden. Damayanti and her handmaids saw this flock of geese alight in their courtyard, and they decided to try catching them. As each girl pursued a goose, the one Damayanti pursued turned and spoke to her. "Princess, there is a king in Nishada named Nala, who rivals the twin Ashvins in beauty. No man is his equal." The goose went on, singing Nala's praises. Damayanti then asked the goose to return to Nala and tell him about her. After this, the princess could think of no one but Nala. She moped around the palace, and nothing could make her happy. When her father, Bhima, was told of her condition, he concluded rightly that it was time to hold her Swayamvar. So the king sent out invitations to all the eligible bachelors in India to come compete for his daughter's hand in marriage. Damayanti's beauty was so famous that the Swayamvar drew all the kings from all over India. Meanwhile, up in heaven, Indra noticed something funny. Remember, Indra's realm is reserved for kings who die in battle, and Indra noticed that there were no new arrivals at his feast. Why had the kings stopped fighting and killing each other? The king of the gods turned to the sage Narada and asked what could have distracted the kingly class from their favorite pastime of killing each other. Narada then told the court about the big Swayamvara for Damayanti. Indra was intrigued. He looked to his buddies, the world guardians, and said, "Let's all go to this Swayamvara and see what the fuss is." Thus the 5 world guardians jumped on their Vimanas and headed for Vidarbha. Nala, of course, had also heard of the big event, and was hurrying along when he came across the gods on their chariots. Indra saw Nala and was struck by his qualities. Landing his Vimana, the god hailed Nala, saying, "Nala of Nishada, best of kings, lend us your help and be our envoy." Nala prostrated before the gods and promised, "I will do as you ask. What is it you would like me to do?" Indra told him, "We are the gods Indra, Agni, Varuna, and Yama. You are to go directly to Damayanti and tell her that the gods have come to marry her. Tell her to choose from among us." At first flattered, Nala was now crushed. He begged, "Please do not send me. I've come for the same reason." It was too late. He'd already agreed, and so Indra sent Nala straight to Damayanti's palace to announce the god's arrival. The palace was surrounded by high walls and had a perimeter of burly soldiers, but this was nothing to Nala. He slipped unseen past the soldiers and climbed the wall. The Princess Damayanti was shocked to see the strange man in her private quarters, but her heart raced uncontrollably at the sight of him. She demanded of him, "Who are you, and how did you get in here?" Nala replied, "I am Nala of Nishada, and I have come as an envoy of the gods. It is by their power that I got here. The gods are wooing you, and they ask you to choose one of them as your husband." Damayanti bowed respectfully to the god's envoy, and then said with a laugh, "Let me know your true feelings, please. What can I do for you? I am at your service. The words the goose spoke to me about you are consuming me. It is because of you that I am having this Swayamvar. If you should reject me, I will kill myself." Nala asked, "How could you want a mortal man when the world guardians have come for you? You really should turn to them, because when mortals displease the gods, they only find death. So save me, princess, and choose one of the gods." Damayanti only smiled and reassured Nala, saying, "There's only one way to save yourself then. Show up at my Swayamvar, and I will choose you before all the people and all the gods, and at least you won't be to blame." Nala then made his way back out of the palace and presented himself to the gods. The gods asked him, "So, did you get to meet the princess? What did she say?" Nala was completely honest, and he told them apologetically what Damayanti had planned. The next day, King Bhima convened the Swayamvar for his daughter. All the greater and lesser kings of India filled the vast stadium, while the world guardians watched down from their hovering vimanas. Then Damayanti entered the arena, and all the kings were able to see this great beauty for the first time. Their eyes were transfixed on her while the names of all the kings were proclaimed. As Damayanti scanned the crowd for her chosen, she saw not one Nala, but 5, all standing together. Each was an identical copy of the other. Realizing the trick, the girl began to worry how she might choose the real Nala and not one of the counterfeits. She puzzled this over, and then recalled that the gods are more perfect than mortals. They don't sweat, their clothes are perfect, and their feet really don't touch the ground. She looked more closely, but she couldn't make out any of these differences among them. Finally, out of ideas, she threw herself on the mercy of the gods. She bowed and declared, "If it is true that I chose Nala to be my husband back when the goose spoke to me, then by that truth must the gods point him out to me now." The purity of her demand manifested the desired outcome. Something changed subtly about the 5 contestants, and Damayanti could suddenly make out a certain dinginess about one of the 5 men. There was a stain on the hem of his lungi, and flies were buzzing as he wiped sweat from his brow. The other 4 remained in their perfection. Their feet didn't even touch the ground. Greatly relieved, Damayanti skipped down off the dais and placed her garland over the real Nala. All the other suitors groaned in disappointment, but the gods were delighted at the drama, and they cheered the victors. Feeling magnanimous, the gods even blessed the pair, promising them twins and giving gifts. Following the wedding ceremony, the happy couple left for Nishada, where they enjoyed a blissful life as king and queen, giving birth to twins, a girl and a boy. Nala and his new queen spent all their time together, except when Nala was off doing all the great things that kings are known for, such as the Ashvamedha horse sacrifice. Everything was just wonderful for the couple, and it seemed that they were destined to live a happy, uneventful life together, but for one incident. It turned out that following the great Swayamvar, as the world guardians were returning to their abodes, they encountered the 2 gods, Dvapar and Kali. Indra inquired where the 2 were headed, and Kali replied that they were suitors headed for Damayanti's bride choice. Indra laughed, saying, "You're too late for that, my friend. The lovely princess has already chosen her groom. She has picked the mortal man Nala above even the gods." Now, I always thought that Kali was female, but in this story she was a he, and he didn't take kindly to being snubbed in favor of mere mortals. Kali said, "If Damayanti picked a human before the gods, then she deserves severe punishment." Indra had just blessed this union, and now Kali was bad-mouthing the decision he had just endorsed. Indra got serious and said, "Hold on a minute here. I just permitted Damayanti to choose Nala. He is a great guy and a deserving king. It would be utter foolishness to curse this fine couple." Indra and his companions then went on their way, imagining the matter had been settled, but that was not the case. Kali was only more outraged. He turned angrily to Dvapara and said, "Indra might think this is all right, but it really ticks me off. I've got to do something about this. I'm going to put these upstarts in their place." Kali then made himself invisible and snuck over to King Nala's palace. Kali's idea was to take control of Nala's mind and drive him to destruction. There was one problem with Kali's plan, however, which was the extreme purity by which Nala conducted his life. The power of his righteousness protected him from dark influences, so Kali was forced to wait 12 years, lurking at the palace and waiting for a chance to ruin this king. Finally, in the 12th year, Kali got his chance, when the king went out to the latrine and didn't wash his hands. This was just the kind of impurity the demon had been waiting for, and Kali imperceptibly slipped into Nala's mind. At the same time, Kali's friend, Dvapar, entered a pair of dice. Under Kali's influence, Nala then approached his opportunistic younger brother Pushkar and suggested a friendly game of dice. Feeling uncomfortable with this, Damayanti asked Nala to give up the idea of dicing, but then Pushkar spoke up, asking if Nala was afraid to play. Unable to decline a challenge, Nala now felt compelled to play. A slow-motion version of the Pandavas' dice game commenced, in which Nala lost every wager to his brother. The stakes must have been much smaller, because the game went on non-stop for months. The court, townspeople, and Damayanti watched helplessly as the king gambled away everything he possessed. Try as she might, Damayanti was unable to stop her husband in his folly. After this had gone on for 2 months, Damayanti summoned the king's counselors and asked them to report on the king's finances. They consulted their accounts and told the queen that they were nearly out of money. Thinking quickly, Damayanti summoned the king's most trusted friend, his charioteer Varshnaya. She said to him, "The king has treated you well over the years, but now he has fallen on hard times. Both I and his advisers have begged him to desist from his gambling, yet now he is nearly ruined. As you love your king, I must ask you a favor. Please take Nala's best chariot and fastest horses. Take my children, the prince and his sister, and bring them to my father's house. Keep them safe." The book then says Varshnaya went to the king's ministers and checked with them. The counselors approved Damayanti's plan, and the charioteer departed with the children for Vidarbha. Arriving at King Bhima's palace, Varshnaya delivered the children, the chariot, and the horses. As for the charioteer, he wandered unhappily, drifting from place to place, until he finally settled in Ayodhya, where he entered the king's service. Following Varshnya's departure, the gambling went on day and night until Nala was wiped out. After staking and losing his kingdom, Nala had nothing left to wager. His triumphant brother laughed and asked, "I think you are bankrupt, brother. What else do you have to stake? All you've got left is your wife. Why don't you stake her? Maybe your luck will finally come back." Nala did not rise to the bait. He simply shrugged off his remaining jewelry and removed his expensive robes and left the game, wearing only a loincloth. Damayanti did not want to be evicted by her brother-in-law. Instead, she put on a one-piece sari and followed her husband into the forest, where the impoverished couple made their camp. As soon as the couple departed, the new king Pushkar ordered his subjects to keep away from Nala and his wife. Thus the pair were left cold and hungry on the borders of their former kingdom. After 3 days of exposure and hunger, Nala saw a pair of birds. Starving, he took off his loincloth and threw it over the birds. The birds then flew off, carrying the cloth away with them. This left poor Nala naked and hungry and not a friend in the world. As they flew away, one of the birds called out, "We are the dice who took your kingdom. We saw you still had this cloth, so we come to take that away too." I'm going to leave you with that cliffhanger until next time, when we'll finish the story of Nala and Damayanti. By the time we're done, you'll realize that Yudhishthira didn't have it so bad after all. Before I go, I'd like to thank you for the comments on the blog, and especially the ratings on iTunes. If you haven't done it yet, please visit the Mahabharata podcast entry at iTunes and leave comments and ratings. It is the very best way to get other people listening to this show. Please also be sure to check out the blog for this podcast, which is at mahabharatapodcast.com. I post additional details on each episode, and you can leave comments and let me know what you think. I'll see you there. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata podcast, episode 29, Damayanti and Nala, part 2. Last episode, we began the story of Nala and Damayanti. The story is traditionally called Nala, but obviously it is more about his clever wife than it is about him. We left off last time with Nala's final defeat at dicing. Left with only a single garment for the two of them, Nala and Damayanti sat shivering and hungry in the forest. Still under Kali's sway, Nala proposed to Damayanti that she should go to her father and stay there until he had recovered his fortune. His queen was shocked at the suggestion that they should separate. She told him that they should both go to her father, where they would be honored in his house. Nala refused this outright. He had once been a proud king, and would never bear the shame of begging at his father-in-law's door. Thus the two continued to wander, attached by their single garment, in search of food and shelter. As evening fell, the couple came across an abandoned hunting lodge and collapsed in exhaustion. Still under Kali's influence, Nala could not sleep. He obsessed with leaving his wife, but then couldn't bring himself to leave. In his delirium, he made excuses, saying he could not leave because he was wearing half of his wife's sari. As if in response to this idea, a sharp knife glinted in the starlight. Madly seizing his chance, Nala took the knife and quietly sliced his piece of cloth away from Damayanti, and he slipped out into the night. When poor Damayanti awoke the next morning, she couldn't bring herself to believe that her husband, after ruining his fortune and squandering her children's future, had now abandoned his wife, half naked, starving in the wilderness. After spending hours calling for her husband and weeping in grief, Damayanti gradually came to realize that she had indeed been abandoned. Now she no longer grieved for herself but for her husband. She knew his true nature, and knew with certitude that her husband must have been manipulated by malignant forces. Not knowing the identity of her assailants, she put a generic curse on them. Whatever creature it is that has cursed my husband to such suffering shall reap even greater suffering than he." Lost in confusion and grief, poor Damayanti wandered the jungle until she was ambushed by an enormous boa constrictor. As the massive snake coiled around her and began to crush her, Damayanti only thought of her husband. How crushed he would be once he awoke from his madness and discovered that his wife had died for lack of protection. She knew his regret would be devastating for him. Just as the fallen queen had given up all hope, a hunter stumbled upon the scene. In an instant the hunter drew his sword and removed the snake's head. He then carried the princess to a nearby stream where she washed and ate some food. As she began to recover from the snake attack, the hunter began to notice just how beautiful and helpless she was. Overcome with lust, the hunter propositioned the queen. Damayanti could hardly believe that she had been rescued from a snake only to be misused by a commoner. She cursed him angrily, saying, "If, even in my heart, I have never thought of anyone but Nala, then let this meat-eating brute drop dead." No sooner had these words left her mouth than the hunter fell dead. Utterly lost in her grief, Damayanti then wandered further into the woods, unconcerned with eating or even her own safety. She wandered like this, ill-clothed and defenseless, in the wild jungle. She encountered giant snakes, tigers, and crocodiles, but her emotions were so deep and strong that none of these creatures molested her. After some days of wandering, she noticed a change in the forest. The trees took on a more noble appearance, and the fierce animals were not to be seen. Going a little further, she came across a forest ashram of ascetics. When these hermits first caught sight of Damayanti, they thought she must be an elemental spirit of the forest. She was lean and dirty, barely clothed, and yet she seemed to glow with a divine power. When Damayanti introduced herself and told them her story, the senior hermit assured her that her streak of bad luck was nearly over, and that soon enough she would see her husband fully restored to his former glory. Shortly after making this prediction, the hermit, the encampment, and their fire pits suddenly vanished, leaving Damayanti wondering if the entire episode had been a dream. Since there was nothing else to be done, the princess resumed her helpless journey, searching for her lost husband. After 3 more days of fruitless wandering, Damayanti finally came across a caravan of merchants, with wagons loaded with goods. Again, the people were astonished and frightened by her wild appearance, but the women took pity on her, and, regardless of whether she was an ogress or a princess, they determined to clean her up and feed her. After eating a meal, Damayanti asked their leader where they were heading, and whether they had any news of Nala. The merchant told her that they had neither seen nor heard of Nala. They were heading for the kingdom of Chedi, and she could come with them. Damayanti agreed to accompany the caravan to Chedi in hopes of finding information about her husband there. That evening they made camp on the banks of a stream. Later that night, when all the travelers were fast asleep, a herd of wild elephants approached the stream to drink. Unfortunately, the merchants had made their camp right in the elephants' path. As the herd pressed in from all sides, they crushed and maimed the people who were sleeping on the ground. Suddenly, people were screaming in pain, and survivors were running for cover. The wagon loads of trade goods were knocked over and trampled, while the few survivors fled into the forest. Poor Damayanti was unscathed, but alone again. She wondered what she had done to deserve such bad luck. Why did so many innocents have to suffer for her offenses? Whom had she offended? Finally realizing that all of her sorrows must have a root cause, she pondered what she had done to deserve this. Whom had she offended that would possess the power to curse her this badly? The list of potential culprits was not long. Only a god could have done all these things. She suspected that Indra or one of the other world guardians had cursed her. As she wandered down the road pondering these things, she came across a few survivors from the caravan tragedy, a group of Brahmins who recognized the spiritual power that she possessed. The woman and the Brahmins continued together down the road to Chedi. As they entered the gates of the city, Damayanti's extremely bedraggled appearance attracted a crowd of street children, who followed after her curiously as she made her way to the city palace. From a window overlooking the town square, the queen mother saw this strange woman, starving and bedraggled, followed by Brahmins and surrounded by street kids. She instinctively deduced that this was no ordinary woman, and so she summoned Damayanti to her palace. When Damayanti presented herself, the Chedi queen mother asked her, "Even though you look like you have a hard life, you still seem to carry yourself with a special nobility. Even though you are unprotected, you go about without fear. Are you a saint, or are you an immortal?" Damayanti bowed low and replied, "I am just a mortal woman who is devoted to her husband. I was a chambermaid of good birth, but now I am alone, living off wild fruit and roots. My husband is a virtuous man, and has always been devoted to me, but by bad luck he succumbed to a gambling addiction, and when he had gambled away all our possessions, he wandered off into the forest. I followed him into the forest, but he was possessed by madness, and he deserted me while I was sleeping. Since then I have been looking for my beloved day and night." The Queen Mother was moved to tears by this sad story. She exclaimed, "Stay here with me, good woman, and I will have my men go out in search of your husband. If you allow me to help you, we shall surely find your husband." Damayanti bowed again, and replied, "I can stay with you, but only under certain conditions. I will not eat leftovers, nor wash people's feet, nor converse at all with other men. If a man importunes me, he shall be punished. I will only see Brahmins so long as it helps in the search. If this can be done, I shall stay. Otherwise, I will continue with my wandering." The Queen Mother happily agreed to all these conditions, and appointed Damayanti to be handmaid to her daughter, the Princess Sunanda. As for Nala, after he had wandered away from his wife into the forest, Nala saw the glow of a fire in the woods. Out of curiosity, he approached the fire to get a better look. As he drew near, he heard a voice calling to him, "Come here, Nala! Come, Punyashloka!" When he got closer, he saw a ring of fire with a giant snake king coiled up in the middle. The snake called out to Nala, "I am the snake Kartotaka. I had attacked an innocent Brahmin, and he cursed me like this. If you will save me, I will do you a great favor in return." Nala agreed to help, and picked up the snake and carried it out of the range of the fire. As soon as he set the snake down, however, the snake bit him. Shocked, Nala looked down on himself and found that his body had shriveled and deformed. The snake said, "Do not worry, I have transformed you so you will not be recognized. Furthermore, my venom has entered your system and it has encased the entity that has given you so much trouble. Even now he is suffering terribly from my poison, and he will continue to suffer as long as he remains within your body. I have made you immune from the one who has tormented you. Now you should go from here to the city of Ayodhya. Tell them your name is Bauka and that you are a charioteer. That king will teach you about dice in return for your skill with horses. When you have become skilled with dice, you'll be reunited with fortune and will rejoin your wife and have your kingdom and children back. I tell you this all is the truth. When you wish to restore your former appearance, just think of me and put on this robe. When you wear this robe, you will regain your old appearance." The Snake King then vanished, leaving this robe laying on the ground. Nala then set out for Ayodhya. After 10 days of travel, he entered the city and made his way to the court of the king, Rituparna. Nala worked his way through the crowd of retainers and hangers-on and introduced himself to the king. He said, "My name is Bauka, and I am a skilled horseman, charioteer, and cook. I am educated in all the royal arts. Take me into your service." When Nala demonstrated his skill with the horses, King Rituparna laughed and said, "I love the fastest horses. I will put you in charge of my stables. My charioteers Varshneya and Jivala will work for you." Thus Nala settled down to a well-paid job in the king's service. But late at night he could always be heard to recite a sad couplet. "Where may you, starving and thirsty, lay down to sleep, fatigued and wretched, as you keep recalling that fool, and who is it you have to serve now?" One night Jivala asked Nala, "Who is this woman you bemoan?" "There was this nitwit who had a wife that loved him very much. For some stupid reason this fool got separated from her, and now he runs around in misery saying this couplet when he feels especially desperate. This man deserted her. It is unlikely she still lives. She is alone, starving and unprotected in the wilderness, where she was abandoned by that idiot." Meanwhile, Nala's father-in-law, Damayanti's father, King Bhima, had not been sitting back. He was fond of his son-in-law and was concerned with his daughter's safety. The king summoned the wandering Brahmins and made them an offer of 1,000 head of cattle, plus the revenues of an entire village, if one of them discovered Nala and Damayanti. The Brahmins set off happily in all directions, searching for the lost royals. One of these, named Sudeva, went to Chedi, and there he caught a glimpse of Damayanti while she was in the queen's presence. Sudeva had known Damayanti back when she was a princess in Vidarbha, and he suspected he had found her. Unsure, Sudeva lingered and observed as Damayanti became handmaiden to the princess of Chedi. After some time watching and waiting, Sudeva finally found an opportunity to speak with the handmaid. He told her, "My name is Sudeva, and I was sent by your father to find you. Your children are all in good health, and they and your parents are longing for your return." Damayanti recognized the Brahmin, and she tearfully asked him about all her relatives in Vidarbha. The nosy queen mother was once again looking out her window, and she saw her new servant sitting with the Brahmin weeping tearfully. Later, the queen mother had the Brahmin summoned to her quarters. She interrogated Sudeva about Damayanti's background. Sudeva then told her the full story, concluding, "There is no mortal who equals her in beauty. Her body may be caked in mud and unadorned, but still her beauty shines through. But I was sure I found her when I spotted the mole on her face that betokens her good fortune." The queen mother then summoned Damayanti, rubbed the mud off her face, and revealed the famous beauty mark. Suddenly it all came back to her. The queen exclaimed, "You are my niece. My sister is Bhima's wife, and I was there when you were born. My home is your home. Just ask for anything you'd like." Damayanti bowed to her aunt and said, "Even as a serving girl I lived here happily, well served and protected. I am sure I would only be happier here now, but I would like your permission to return home. My children are waiting, and my father is worried for me. Please grant me the use of a wagon so I may return home." The queen mother was happy to grant the request, and Damayanti was sent home on a human-carried palanquin with a royal honor guard. She rested that same evening in her father's palace. The very next day, Damayanti resumed the search for Nala. She composed a poem about a gambler who cut her dress and left her. She asked all the Brahmins to go off once again and search for Nala. She ordered them to recite the poem wherever they went. She offered the same reward Sudeva had earned when he discovered her. Some time later, after hundreds of Brahmins had come and gone empty-handed, a Brahmin reported a curious incident in the kingdom of Ayodhya. He said he had recited the poem to the king and nobles there, and none had reacted, but an odd hunchback in the king's service broke into tears when he heard it. The man was named Bauka, and he was the king's charioteer. The Brahmin questioned this malformed servant, and Bauka's reply was another poem. Damayanti absorbed this information, and then summoned the Brahmin Sudeva. She gave Sudeva some instructions and sent him off to Ayodhya to find this charioteer. Sudeva went straight off to King Rituparna and announced before the court that Damayanti had given up on ever finding Nala and was holding a second Swayamvar to choose a new husband. This bride choice was scheduled for just a few days later. So Rituparna needed to get there fast. He summoned his master of horses and told him to prepare the horse and chariot so he could reach Vidarbha in less than one day. The king chose Bahuka to be his driver. Bahuka Nala wondered whether he had finally been abandoned, or was this some new plan by his clever wife. He knew he had no right to expect anything better than abandonment, but still he held out hope that she might take him back. Bahuka didn't have much time for fretting over this, because he had to deliver his master to Vidarbha post-haste. He assembled the horses, loaded up the chariot, and he, the king, and Varshnaya took off at top speed for Damayanti's second Swayamvar. As the three men sped off for Vidarbha, Varshnaya and the king marveled at Bahuka's skill with the horses. They raced at speeds that they had not thought possible. At one point, the king's shawl blew off his shoulders. Varshnaya called for Bahuka to stop the car so they could jump down and fetch the king's shawl. Bahuka laughed and said, "Too late for that. The shawl is already several miles behind us. We'll get a new one in Vidarbha." Bahuka's skills and temperament continuously reminded Varshnaya of his old master Nala. But then he looked at the deformed little man and could not believe they were one and the same. The trio made such good progress that the king began to relax a bit. They were sure to make it to Vidarbha on time. The king began to expound on the mysteries of numbers and the dice. Rituparna said, "Knowledge resides in no man, but any information is available to the one who knows how to access it." To make a demonstration, the king pointed to an oak tree and said, "The number of leaves on that tree, less the acorns that are on the ground, amounts to 34,125. Bahuka, in disbelief, stopped the chariot and actually counted the leaves and acorns, and found the king had been perfectly correct. Bahuka said, "With this skill with numbers, dice must be like child's play to you." Rituparna said, "I could teach you to be the master of any dice game in exchange for your knowledge of horses." Bahuka readily agreed to this offer, and the king trained him in this secret knowledge while they flew down the road to Vidarbha. Bahuka was a quick study, and apparently attained some kind of enlightenment, as we see later. After divining the number of mangoes in a tree and predicting the rolls of the dice several times in a row, he suddenly got sick. The withered man darted for a nearby ditch and retched. After several violent spasms, Bahuka barfed up a black ball of stinking venom. The ball began to twitch, and out of the ball sprang the shrunken and weakened form of Kali. In that instant, Nala recovered his wits. The scope of his folly and the nature of his victimization suddenly came in full focus. Nala recoiled and was thinking of a really stinging curse to put on Kali, when the wretched creature knelt and folded his hands in supplication. Kali said, "Restrain your anger, sir. I am ready to help you reach the greatest fame. Ever since your wife cursed me in that hut in the forest, I have been suffering intensely. I have been burned day and night by the snake's venom. Let me make up for you now." Nala restrained his anger, and in that moment's hesitation, Kali snuck off into the woods. Feeling better than he had in months, Nala returned to the king's chariot and whipped the horses on to Vidarbha. Later that day, Damayanti was looking out onto the streets of the city when she saw a royal chariot racing in. The speed and the sound were so great that she thought for sure her husband Nala must be driving the horses. She was stricken when she saw King Rituparna step off the chariot, but did not see her husband. King Bhima had come out to greet this visitor, and asked him why he had come at this time. Rituparna was smart enough to have noticed the lack of preparations and nobility, so he figured the talk of Swamvar was some kind of ruse. So he told Bhima that he had merely come to visit. Bhima suspected there was more to it, but he had too much tact to question him further. While Kings Bhima and Rituparna entertained themselves, and Nala camped out with the horses, Damayanti puzzled over the question of the king's charioteers. She recalled that Varshnaya had been in Nala's service and had moved on to work for Rituparna, but she knew nothing of the crippled little man who drove the horses as well as King Nala. The princess sent a servant named Kashini to spy on the charioteer and bring back information. Later, Kashini reported back to Damayanti and told her that this little man had some remarkable traits. She noticed, for instance, that he did not lower his head to walk under low doorways. Instead, the lintel rose up to let him pass. When his cart was in a narrow lane, the road seemed to widen to let him through. As he cooked for his master, she had seen him fill pots with water from out of the air, and had seen him start fires with a mere glance. These abilities were remarkable, even for Nala, but Damayanti was clever enough not to be discouraged. In fact, she suspected her husband had somehow transformed his appearance and might indeed be the charioteer, Bahuka. Damayanti then ordered the servant to return to the cook, and when he wasn't looking, to swipe a sample of his cooking. Kashini did as she was told, and returned with a portion of meat. As soon as the princess tasted his cooking, she no longer had any doubt. Regardless of his appearance, his backstory, or his status, somehow he must be Nala. So certain was she that she sent Kashini on one more mission, this time to her mother, the queen. Her message went, "I have tested Bahuka many ways, because I suspect he is Nala. Only his appearance casts doubt. I would like to see him for myself. Either send him to me, or allow me to visit him. It may be done with father's knowledge or without." The virtuous queen went to Bhima with this message, and the old man approved. Bahuka was summoned before Damayanti. As soon as the little man entered the chamber and bowed, Damayanti laid into him. "Tell me, have you ever heard of a man who deserted his wife as she lay sleeping unprotected in the jungle? What man would leave his beloved and innocent wife in the forest and go away? What a wrong I must have done to that king, that he deserted me in the midst of the wilderness. This man whom I chose even above the gods themselves, how could he desert his loving and faithful wife, the mother of his children?" At these words, Bahuka collapsed to the floor in grief. He cried, "It was not my fault that I was struck with madness and lost my kingdom, and abandoned you. I was possessed and cursed by Kali, and he drove all my actions. You had cursed him that night in the forest, and ever since he had suffered with me. Like twigs on a fire, he was constantly burned by your curse. He remained within me until just a few days ago, when I awakened to spiritual mastery. But now Kali is gone, and there shall indeed be an end to our misery. That evil spirit has left me, and I have come here only to reunite with you. But I have heard that you are seeking a new husband. I deeply regret that I ever left you, but I was not in control. So what possessed you to seek a new husband while your old one might yet be alive?" Damayanti rejoined, "My lord, do not suspect me of doing evil. Did I not send even the gods away in order to choose you? I have spent fortunes in seeking you out, and when I suspected you were in Rituparna's service, I had him come here the fastest way I could think of. I swear by the three gods who support all creation that this is true." Just then the wind spoke from the sky. "We swear this is true. Damayanti has preserved her honor, and we have been her guardians for these 3 years. Her stratagem was excellent, because only you, of all mortals, could have carried the king of Ayodhya this far in a single day. Have no more suspicions. Rejoin your wife." As if to guarantee that no skeptic could later say it was a ventriloquist, heavenly drums sounded in all directions, and flower petals rained down on the royal gathering. On this cue, Nala pulled out his special snake robe, thought of the magic snake, and put it on. In a flash, crooked Bahuka transformed into the glorious King Nala. Despite the years of hardship, both the king and his wife quickly regained their former beauty. After a blissful night together, Nala went to his former master, Rituparna, and explained what had happened. The enlightened king was delighted to have played a part in the whole entertaining affair. King Bhima embraced his son-in-law, and endowed him with the lands that had been his wife's dowry, as well as the services of a small army. After a month of preparations, Nala assembled a small fighting force and set out for his brother's kingdom of Nishada. I find this next little detail interesting because it gives us an idea of the basic size of a Bronze Age military unit. We are told that Nala's strike force consisted of a single chariot, 16 war elephants, 50 horses, and 600 infantry. Nala led his forces right up to his brother's city gates and issued a challenge, saying, "I have returned for one more round of dice. I have regained my wealth and I have regained my wife. Now I stake all of these, and even my own life, for your kingdom and your life. If not, then here is my army, and we shall have a trial by arms, and let the victor take all." Ever since the last time the two had played, Nala's brother Pushkar had not once lost a throw at dice. He was so good that most would not gamble with him, and he had grown bored with it. But Nala's offer stirred him. He observed that Damayanti had not lost her famous good looks. Pushkar said, "I'm so glad that you are rich again, and that you have your wife back, and now you'd like to lose them all to me. I always regretted that I had not won pretty Damayanti the last time we played. I would never have left her in the forest. She has always been in my heart." Nala was angered enough to cut his insolent brother's head off, but he controlled himself and simply said, "Enough with talking, let's play. After you win, you can talk some more." Pushkar agreed, fetched the dice, and made his throw. I'm sure most of you have already guessed the outcome, so I'll just tell you that Pushkar rolled the dice, fully expecting to win one last time, but this time the dice did not obey their master. The roll went in Nala's favor, and he won the round. Pushkar had lost everything to Nala. He had staked the kingdom of Nishada as well as his very life. Nala was generous in his victory. He did not blame his brother for what had happened. He knew that they had all been pawns in Kali's dark game. Nala forgave his brother and granted him the governorship and revenues of one of his cities. Pushkar was grateful for his brother's forbearance and left for his new lands without causing further trouble. The restored King Nala then summoned his wife, and the two made a triumphant entry in their recovered city, where the two royals sponsored many sacrifices and supported countless Brahmins. If you recall from 2 episodes back, this entire story was being recited by the sage Brihadashva to Yudhishthira. The sage concluded his tale, saying, "Just as Nala eventually recovered everything he had lost and won renown in the process, so too will you, in time, win back your lands and titles." Nala had lost everything, and had even lost his wife in the wilderness. You, at least, still have your brothers and your wife. You are attended daily by the most virtuous Brahmins, so take heart. What really do you have to complain about? This story is said to be the history of Kali's downfall. You can take courage from this because it teaches us that riches can come and go, so the wise man handles both with detachment. Just like Nala, I expect you are worried that you may be challenged to gamble once again. Allow me to alleviate your fears. I can teach you the secrets of the dice, so you need not worry about losing any more. Yudhishthira was delighted to receive this help, and the king sat down with the sage and learned how to predict the next roll of the dice, and even how to control the way the dice landed. Following this lesson, Brihadashva wandered off, and other seers and Brahmins arrived from all directions to trade news at the Pandavas' camp. Among the wanderers were some sadhus who had just come down out of the mountains to the north, and they reported how Arjun had parked himself on a mountain peak and was starving himself and practicing yoga relentlessly. They told him, "The mighty Partha has undertaken impossible suffering. No one has ever seen a mortal perform such powerful austerities." At this news, the brothers were again plunged into depression and worry about their favorite brother. I guess the story of Nala didn't do much to cheer them up after all. This ends the story of Nala and Damayanti. Next time, we'll get news of Arjun's adventures in heaven and get an in-depth travel guide to ancient India's holy places. Thanks for listening. This is the Mahabharata podcast, episode 30, Agastya. Last time, we finished the story of Nala and Damayanti, and Yudhishthira learned some dice tricks from Brihadashva. If you found parts of the Nala storyline difficult to follow, you're not alone. For instance, I find it hard to explain why Nala remained in hiding for so long after he discovered the whereabouts of his wife and had the ability to regain his old form at any time. He apparently stayed in Rituparna's service for a year or more, when he could have reclaimed his name, wife, and family at any time. It is the kind of storyline that would make a great opera, but the narrative is hard to swallow as literature. Perhaps some earlier version of the story had more details to fill in the logical gaps. The question of an original version also makes me wonder about the curious parallels between Nala's story and the Pandava story. For instance, Damayanti had to choose from 5 Nalas at her Swamvara, while Draupadi chose 5 husbands. The dice match is an obvious parallel, but how about the whole difficulty with Damayanti's clothing, which echoes Draupadi's disrobing? Later, the Pandavas, like Nala, will assume menial positions in a king's court. There is a mysterious kinship between the tale of the Pandavas and the tale of Nala, but who knows if we'll ever work out their genealogies. So we left off with the Pandavas still in the forest and miserable over news that Arjun was starving himself on a mountainside. Their next visitor was the sage Narada, and Yudhishthira asked Narada after the benefits of visiting the holy places. Narada then provided a long, detailed travel guide to the ancient tourist spots. I will spare you all the gruesome details. The list of sites runs 30 pages, listing scores of sacred fords, rivers, lakes, and mountains. At each of these locations, one could attain different merits. For instance, at many fords, a little fasting and meditation there could win as much merit as several horse sacrifices. It is interesting to note that at this time in Indian history, the holy sites were not temples, cities, or relics. Instead, they are all natural locations of spiritual power. No mention is made whether these sites even had temples for worship. The whole focus is on the natural environment. So far as I can tell, no mention of a temple has been made so far in the Mahabharata. Other than Brahmins, it is unclear how the common people focus their worship. A few interesting anecdotes from this long list of destinations include the Sapta Sarasvata ford, where the famous holy man Mankanaka found enlightenment. There he cut his hand, and from the wound flowed vegetable juice. The little guy was so excited at his achievement that he started dancing in delight. Mankanaka's soul had reached such a fine vibration that all the entities around him, animate and inanimate, started dancing in sympathetic resonance. The neighboring sadhus were disturbed to see the very earth and trees begin dancing and flying around. So, as they often do, they ran complaining to their patron god Shiva. Shiva appeared before Mankanaka and asked him, "Why are you dancing like that?" The giddy sadhu pulled out a thorn and showed Shiva how his blood ran vegetarian. Shiva laughed and said, "That's very nice. Now check this out." Shiva then pricked his thumb, and from the cut ran ashes. Mankanaka threw himself on the ground and worshipped the god, saying, "No other god is more supreme than Rudra. Thou art the maker and cause of the worlds. By thy grace all the other gods enjoy this reality." Shiva then blessed Mankanaka and said, "Anyone who bathes here shall find nothing is beyond their reach." It would be interesting to map out all of these ancient locations, but we can be sure that they extended east to the Bay of Bengal and west to the Indus, north into the Himalayas, and south into the Deccan region. The loss of the Sarasvati River must have been traumatic, because many of these sites were located on the banks of that legendary river. While each of these holy places held great merit, it would appear the very best place for a sadhu to make his fire was the field of the Kurus, Kurukshetra. Narada said, "The Naimisha woods are sacred, but no place stands out like Kurukshetra. Even the dust that blows from that place brings blessings. Those who dwell in Kurukshetra are already in heaven. Even if one just says, 'I shall go to Kurukshetra,' has assured himself of salvation." When Narada finished describing all the sacred locations, he concluded by pointing out that many of these places were infested with Rakshasas, and thus no one had been able to visit them for years. Narada instructed the Pandavas to lead the holy men on a tour of these sites, where they might protect them and clear the sites of dangers. He pointed out that the last man to accomplish this grand tour had been their uncle Bhishma. Bhishma had gained immense merit for his actions, but Yudhishthira will gain 8 times that merit because he will be leading and protecting other holy men. The next visitor to the Kanyaka woods was the sage Lomasha, who had just been sent from Indra's palace to send the Pandavas on their pilgrimage. The sage began by bringing the brothers news of Arjun's great achievements, the WMD, and his journey to heaven. He then recited the message he had been sent to tell. He said, "Your younger brother Arjun shall soon return with the weapons you desired, but he has one more deed to accomplish, which even the gods cannot complete. You are not to worry about Karna. That son of a Sutta is not worth even 1/16 of Arjun in battle. All of your fears and worries will be dispelled once the left-handed archer returns." Lomasha concluded his message, saying, "Your brother also requested that I accompany you on the tour of the sacred fords. I have completed this tour 3 times already, so I shall be your guide." Yudhishthira readily agreed, and he began making preparations for departure. First, he called together all his dependents, presumably Brahmins who preferred handouts over hard traveling. He directed them to go to Hastinapur, where Dhritarashtra would take care of them. He said, "If that king will not help, then go to Panchala, where you certainly will be well received." Then the brothers packed their weapons and set out for the first stop on their itinerary, Naimisha Forest. From there they wandered eastward, past the confluence of the Yamuna and Ganga, and eventually onto a place called Agastya's hermitage at Durjaya. Yudhishthira asked Lomasha to tell them more about this famous hermit, Agastya. Lomasha began with an anecdote about a pair of foul, rude asuras who used to live in this area. The 2 were brothers, the eldest named Ilvala and the younger Vatapi. Ilvala had the singular talent that he could summon a soul back into its body after it had died. The best he could think to do with this ability was to kill and cook his younger brother, feed the meat to some unsuspecting victim, and then recall his brother. The 2 laughed uproariously as Vatapi materialized and blew the victim into pieces. They took particular pleasure in playing this trick on Brahmins. I guess they should not have been eating meat in any case. Lomasha then turned to the subject of Agastya. Agastya must have been a well-known heroic hermit because no time is wasted on his background. The story picks up when Agastya had a powerful dream of his ancestors, all tied up and hanging upside down in a cave. Agastya asked them how he could help them, and they all cried out in one voice, "Offspring! We are your own ancestors and have ended up here because we have no one to carry on our line. If you were to beget an heir, it will rescue us from this hell." Agastya agreed to find himself a wife, but he still had the difficulty that there was no woman he felt worthy of him. Taking matters into his own hands, Agastya assembled animal parts that he felt had merit, and gave this strange assembly to the king of Nishada, whose queen soon thereafter gave birth to a daughter. The girl's name was Lopamudra. Agastya returned to his hermitage and waited until Lopamudra was old enough to marry. After many years had passed, Agastya presumed the girl was ready, and he returned to Nishada asking for Lopamudra. The king hesitated to send his noble daughter to live in the woods with a dirty old sadhu, but he feared what Agastya might do if he refused. Lopamudra allayed his worries. She said, "Please, father, do not worry on my account. Allow me to marry Agastya and save you from trouble." With crude ceremony, Agastya took the young princess as his wife. His first command was for her to shed her jewels and silks and to wear bark and deerskin instead. The girl obediently did as she was told and took up the rough life of a hermit's wife, even joining in with him in his meditations and fasting. The hermit was pleased with his compliant wife, and he told her to get ready because it was time to consummate. The girl bowed and said, "No doubt a husband takes a wife in order to have children. Please allow me a small pleasure in return. Please let me lie in as fine a bed as I used to have in my father's palace, and I would like you to come with me in nice clothes while I am adorned with jewels." The old hermit asked, "Do you see any jewels here, girl? Where would I find such a bed?" Lopamudra replied, "With all the spiritual power that they say you have, obtaining these things should be quite easy." The old guy thought about it for a while and then said, "It's true that I have such merit, but I will not waste it on such frumpery." The girl said, "There aren't many days left, Lord, and I do not wish to lie with you unless it is just so." Agastya reluctantly agreed to her terms, but he still wasn't going to waste his powers making cheap miracles, so he decided instead to hit up some rich guy for a donation. His first target was the king Shrutarvan, who had a reputation as a wealthy man. Agastya visited this king and asked, "Sire, I have come in search of wealth. Give me a share of yours, if that can be done without depriving others." The king well knew what Agastya might do if he turned the hermit down. So he summoned the best liars in the kingdom, his accountants. The accountants presented the king's financial statements and asked Agastya to name his price from the kingdom's profits. The hermit examined the books, but the accounts showed that the king had not made a profit in decades. The naive sadhu had no training in reading financial statements, so he gullibly took the accountants at their word. He believed there was no extra wealth to be gained here. The king volunteered that his neighboring king was really wealthy and offered to escort Agastya to his neighbor's borders. The king volunteered that his neighboring king was really wealthy and offered to escort Agastya to his neighbor's borders. The hermit accepted the king's offer, and the two departed for the border. This second king, Vajrayashva, had spies at King Shrutravan's court, and so he had already heard how that king had gotten Agastya safely off his hands. So Vajrayashva used the same trick, cooking up a set of books for Agastya to look over. For a second time, Agastya conceded that this king was also operating at a loss and could not spare a penny. The hermit asked, "Where else might I find the wealth that I require?" Vajrayashva replied, "We do have some wicked Daityas for a neighbor, whose leader is called Ilvala. These murderous asuras have an immense hoard of wealth that they won by deceit and cruelty. The asura Ilvala was the same demon we learned of earlier, who enjoyed blowing up Brahmins." The two kings and Agastya then traveled to Ilvala's court, and Agastya again made his request for treasure. Ilvala welcomed them all and offered them a banquet, with his brother cooked in the main dish. These kings both had heard of Ilvala's pastimes, and they had no appetite. Agastya, on the other hand, ate heartily. He ate the entire meat dish and then leaned back in satisfaction. Ilvala giggled in anticipation and then called back his brother. Rather than getting the spectacle of an exploding sadhu, his guest let out a long, wet fart. Vatapi had been completely digested. He was no more. Considering that his trick had just backfired horrifically, Ilvala took it pretty well. I guess he'd met his match and knew it. The asura reluctantly divulged 10,000 cows, as many gold pieces, and a golden chariot to each of the kings, while Agastya demanded 3 times as much for his share. It must have been quite a sight to see Ilvala's demonic retainers delivering a king's ransom to the yard of a dilapidated old dugout. The hermit had all the riches arrayed before his wife. Lopamudra then said, "My lord, you have carried out my wish. Now beget on me a powerful child." Agastya said, "Very well then, but you must choose. Would you rather have 1,000 sons, or 100 who are each worth 10, or 10 who equal 100 each, or a single son worth 1,000? Lopamudra replied, "I'll take 1 son who equals 1,000, for a wise and virtuous son is better than many of no virtue." Lomasha concluded his story, saying, "So the old sadhu and his wife got together, and the couple had a son, the mighty sage Durdasu." After all the storytelling, the pilgrims resumed their tour, visiting the rivers Nanda and Kaushiki, where one's sins are washed away in a single dip. Next time, we'll hear the story of Rishyashringa and what this strange fellow has to do with unicorns and the medieval legend of Barlam and Josephet. Thanks for listening.